The Truth About Agnes by Judy Gardner. Read by Andrew Sachs.
The world seemed very quiet when she got off the bus and stood still for a moment, trying to pierce the darkness that rose up on all sides. I wish there were street lamps, she thought, watching the bus lights until they'd become extinguished by a bend in the road. Then her eyes adjusted themselves, and in the cool starlight she could make out the shapes of hedges and gates, and down the side of the lane the black mass of sleeping woodland. Darkness and isolation might be something of a disadvantage, but a country cottage lent by a kind friend was ideal in every other respect for the final stage of recuperation from a serious illness. Already the soft air, the scent of trees and bracken, and the song of the birds had made her feel a different person, stronger, happier, and calmer. With every quiet day, the memories of pain and fearfulness were steadily receding. Crossing the road, she turned down the lane where small night creatures rustled in the dry verges, and the dense trees seemed to be watching her. There was no wind. She walked briskly, thinking with pleasure of the film she'd seen, and she was less than half a mile from the cottage when a man suddenly stepped out from the trees and said, "Excuse me, can you tell me the right time?" Startled, she caught her breath. I'm sorry, I haven't got my watch," she said after a momentary hesitation. "But in any case, I think it'd be too dark to see it." "Yes, I suppose you're right," the man said, and remained standing on the side of the path just in front of her. He appeared a little less than medium height, and his voice had a gentle, curiously caressing quality. In the darkness it was impossible to distinguish his features in any detail. "It's a beautiful night," he told her. "Yes," she replied, stepping past him. "So lovely and calm." A courteous woman, she tried to give the impression of civility while increasing the distance between them as swiftly as possible. "Good night," she added, half over her shoulder. She walked on, projecting her thoughts ahead of her to the cottage where supper and a new library book awaited her. As the man said, it was a beautiful evening, but for all that she might well put a match to the sitting-room fire. Her thoughts stopped abruptly as she became aware of the grass rustling behind her. She heard the soft rub of his clothes as he walked along, following in her footsteps. Involuntarily she quickened her pace. "Excuse me," he said again, "but do you live near here?" "Yes, no," she replied without turning her head. "No, I live in London." She hoped that he would note the dismissive quality in her tone and go away. The lane was very lonely. "I'd like to live in London," said the man in his soft, yearning voice. "Which part of it do you live in?" She didn't answer, but quickened her steps a little more. Her heart began to beat faster, though whether from exertion or apprehension she was unable to tell. "Please, talk to me," said the man. "Please tell me which part of London you live in." "Go away," she replied over her shoulder. "Please, go away and stop bothering me." Indignation began to mingle with apprehension, and she hurried along, straining her eyes through the brooding darkness. The man remained silent until she began to hope he had melted back into the woods as mysteriously as he had appeared. There wasn't very far to go now. "Please," he said suddenly, "please let me walk along with you. I've just done something terrible, and I've got to talk to someone." Fear prickled her skin. "Go away!" she cried, and turning her head caught a glimpse of his pale face glimmering a dozen paces behind her. He was walking quite silently. "I want to talk to you." "But I have no intention of talking to you. Please," he said in the same yearning, clinging voice. "Please, dear, I promise I won't hurt you." Gripping her handbag firmly under her arm, she broke into a run, stumbling slightly as her foot caught in a tussock of grass. The cottage must be very near now, and she swerved suddenly from the soft verge and ran into the roadway, her heels clacking. Panting, she cursed the darkness and thought how disastrous it would be if, in her haste, she missed the cottage and ran past it. It lay somewhere on the other side of the lane, set in a tangled country garden behind a paling fence. "I won't hurt you, I only want to talk to you," went on the voice behind her, still about the same distance away. Its sad entreaty rang in her brain, filling her with a shuddering abhorrence. She became increasingly aware of a desperate need to escape. "I want to tell you something," came the man's voice, panting. "I want to tell you about poor Agnes." Unheeding, she ran on, and relief flooded through her as she saw the white palings of the cottage gleaming in the dark. Panting, she threw herself at the gate, which burst obligingly open, and as her tired legs carried her swiftly up the front path, her fingers closed on the door key that lay in her coat pocket. Fumblingly, she inserted it in the big old-fashioned lock. The door opened, and she rushed inside. Through the sobbing of her breath, she heard the man's feet thudding softly on the path behind her. Then she slammed the door loudly, triumphantly, and collapsed against it. She remained leaning there, her eyes closed, her heart pumping as if it would burst. She was safe. When the pounding of her heart had subsided a little, she went through into the sitting room, where she drew the curtains very closely before switching on the light. She sat down on the sofa and lit a cigarette with fingers that were still trembling. Tiredly she relaxed against the cushions, stretching her legs out in front of her. Unaccustomed to violent exercise, the muscles in them were still jumping and twitching, as if in protest. The cottage was silent, safe. Little by little its peacefulness stole over her, and after a while she was able to regulate her breathing to the slow tick of the grandfather clock. She began to smile at the memory of her undignified flight through the darkness. He only wanted to talk to her, he said. Talk to her. About someone called Agnes. Crushing out her cigarette, she stood up, then struck a match and held it to the neatly laid wood fire. Smoke curled up from it. She took off her coat before going out to the kitchen to make the coffee for supper. She felt pleasantly hungry. The kitchen was across the hall at the side of the house, and she drew the gingham curtains before switching the kettle on to boil. Reaching for a fresh bottle of milk, she was half obscured by the fridge door when she heard a sudden, sharp click. Frozen into immobility, she remained crouching with the milk in her hand while she listened to the creak that told her someone had opened the back door. Fool, she'd forgotten to lock it before going to the pictures. "Hello?" the man's voice said gently. Sick at heart, she replaced the milk bottle in the fridge, closed the door, and turned round to face him. "What do you want?" she asked coldly. Seen in detail for the first time, he was a pale, rather delicate-looking man with thinning hair and a soft, full mouth. He was wearing canvas shoes, dark trousers, and a gabardine jacket buttoned closely at the neck. "I told you," he said, closing the door and leaning against it. "I've got to talk to you. I've got to tell you about something terrible I've just done." His voice cracked slightly, and with a quick movement he covered his face with one hand. Although his body appeared slight, his hands were wide and seemed to her as if they might possess an unusual strength. Her heart began to pound heavily. "I don't wish to hear it," she said. I don't know who you are, but you've no right to follow me, and you've certainly no right to come in here without being asked. If you don't go immediately, I shall phone for the police." With another abrupt movement, he uncovered his face and stood staring at her, a shrewd, calculating stare from which all entreaty had vanished. "He's mad," she thought incredulously. "He's escaped from somewhere." Behind her, the kettle began to sing. Without taking her eyes off him, she reached behind her and switched it off. Its little song died. "Get out," she said. "Get out." "You're just like Agnes," he said, still staring. "Always angry." "Who is Agnes?" She asked the question involuntarily. "My wife." The hardness fell from his face, and his features appeared to crumple. She became freshly aware of his full, loose-lipped mouth. "Oh, my poor Agnes," he said. "I've harmed her. I've harmed her so badly." Blindly, he took a step forward into the kitchen, his hands outstretched as if he was feeling his way, and instantly her brave anger gave way to a rush of primitive terror. The man was a murderer. Somewhere, perhaps nearer than she knew, his wife was lying strangled or stabbed. Fragmentary pictures of nameless horror flashed through her mind, and almost of their own volition her legs carried her towards the door into the hall. Instantly he was after her, his canvas shoes squeaking on the tiled floor. With a sob she turned towards the staircase and bolted up it, 2 steps at a time, leaving one of her sandals behind. She heard him stumble over it. Upstairs the bedroom doors stood open, and she flung herself through the first one and crashed the door in his face. For a moment she felt his weight behind it on the other side and heard the soft gasp of his breath, but with a strength of desperation she held it closed. With her cheek pressed against the rough oak, she closed her eyes, and tears began to run down her face. "Go away," she prayed. "Please, please go away." Never before had she felt so bitterly conscious of the meaning of isolation. She began to listen, straining her ears to hear what he was doing on the other side of the door. She could hear nothing. Quickly she removed one hand from the door and wiped it across her wet cheeks before replacing it. Silence. She waited almost without breathing for the sound of a footstep, the creak of a floorboard that would betray his whereabouts. But the cottage was wrapped in utter stillness. Slowly and experimentally, she lessened her weight on the door, shifting her body so that only her hands and forearms were pressed against it. The door remained closed. With her eye, she measured the distance to the heavy chest of drawers that stood with its back to the same wall in which the door was set. No more than 7 or 8 feet, she calculated, and told herself that when she had counted 10, she was to run across to it and shunt it in front of the door. Gently working her other foot out of its sandal, she rehearsed the movement in her mind. 1, leave the door. 2, run to the chest. 3, push it towards the door. But which would be best? To push it or to pull it? And supposing she couldn't shift it? Closing her eyes, she began to count. 8, 9, 10. She sprang, slipping on the polished oak boards and grabbing at the chest as if it were a lifebelt. Thrusting her hip against it, she tried to move it. It refused to budge. She tried again, bending almost double and exerting every ounce of strength. Her heart seemed to fill her entire body with its rapid, unsteady beat. Protestingly, the chest gave a little squawk before beginning its journey to the door. 2 feet away, it stopped abruptly, and despite her frantic pushing, refused to move any more. Sobbing with frustration, she ran around to the other side and discovered that it had come hard up against an electric light point. Tugging and wrenching, she pulled it away from the wall, and it slid across to the door with an ease that was almost funny. With the chest in position, she became possessed of a demoniacal energy, pushing the single divan from its alcove and standing it in front of the chest, where she piled it up with chairs, the bedside table, and a bookcase. Even the rug she seized and flung on board, as if its added weight would help, and when there was nothing left save the curtains and pictures, she climbed onto the divan herself and sat there, exhausted, dishevelled, and grimly triumphant. The room she was in was not her own bedroom. Papered with roses in between the beams and with its dormer window swagged with frilled muslin, it had a white cupboard in the corner that contained the hot water tank, and she sat curled on the divan listening to the occasional gloop-gloop that came from it. To begin with, the sound of it breaking the stillness had exacerbated her nerves, but gradually she had grown to recognize it as a friendly domestic voice and her one remaining link with the normal world. There was no sound from the man, no creak or rustle, no hint as to his whereabouts. Rummaging through the books that had fallen from the bookcase onto the bed, she tried to read, but it was impossible to concentrate. She wished she knew the time. Chilled, she tucked the counterpane round her legs and wondered for the 100th time what the man was doing. whether he'd gone away, or whether he was sitting motionless outside the door, patient as a spider in a web. He was a maniac. On his own confession, he had done something unspeakable to his wife, and in an effort to blot out persistent visions of the body, she began counting the roses on the wallpaper. Then another thought struck her, jerking her upright. Now that she was barricaded securely in the bedroom, what was to stop the man from ransacking the place, stripping it quietly and efficiently of its silver, its pieces of bow and Chelsea china, the tiny antique silhouettes that hung in the hall? She'd left her handbag in the sitting room with her purse in it and her checkbook. Fresh horror filled her. It wasn't as if the cottage was hers. It had only been lent by a kind friend who trusted her, and here she was congratulating herself on her astuteness when, in reality, she'd done precisely what the man wanted her to do. Pushing the counterpane aside, she got off the bed and stood listening to the deep silence, then, leaning across the heap of furniture, switched off the light. Pulling back the muslin curtains, she opened the window to its widest extent, gazing apprehensively at the smooth expanse of thatched roof that gleamed dull gold in the starlight. Her only hope was to get out of the room silently so that she could creep into the sitting room and phone for the police. Quickly, before her courage wavered, she climbed onto the narrow sill and eased her body through the window. The night air struck cold, and somewhere close at hand a bird complained in its sleep. The thatch stretched below the dormer window, sloping quite gently until it ended above the sitting room, no more than 7 feet from the ground. Taking a deep breath, she turned to face the bedroom, then carefully lowered herself until she was hanging by her hands from the windowsill, the straw rough against her outstretched body. Her heart was beginning to pound again, and closing her eyes, she slowly relinquished her grip and started to slide down. As her progress quickened, she dug her fingers into the thatch, seeking desperately to prepare for the moment when the roof ended and she would have to fall. She fell. It happened quickly, and she lay huddled in the flower bed below the sitting-room window, listening and trying to regain her breath. She was unhurt. Cautiously, she stood up, conscious of the dew-damp soil on her stockinged feet. The sitting-room lamp still glowed softly behind the drawn curtains, and everywhere had the same sleeping stillness about it. Crouching against the wall, she crept round the corner of the cottage towards the back door. It was ajar, a pencil of light falling across the step. She pushed it a little wider and pressed her nose and one eye to the aperture. The kitchen was empty. She slipped inside and stood listening. No sound. Everything was exactly as she'd left it. She crept across to the door that led into the hall. There was no sign of him. Careful not to make a sound, she tiptoed into the sitting room and glided across to the table where the telephone stood. Even as her finger began to dial 999, she was still unable to grasp that the room was really empty of his presence. The only sounds were the whir of the phone's dial and the peaceful tick of the clock. The fire had settled low in the hearth, and her handbag still lay on the chair by her coat. The room was undisturbed. She dialed the third 9. "Don't do that, dear," he said gently, and the top of his head rose above the back of the settee. He stood up and came over to her, and as the operator's voice spoke, he placed his hand on hers and restored the receiver to its resting place. It gave a little click. The fight went out of her. Wearily, hopelessly, she leant against the wall and covered her face with her hands. "I loved Agnes," he said. "I really did." "Then why—" she began dully. "I stopped loving her because she was so cruel." They were sitting on either side of the dying fire, he huddled on the settee with his hands pressed between his knees, and she strained upright in the chair. Just let him talk, she thought. Humour him, agree with everything he says, and don't lose the slightest opportunity to get to the phone. But she felt desperately weary. "I couldn't help it," he said, staring down at his hands. "I just had to punish her." Very quietly she asked, "What did you do to her?" "Killed her," he said. To hear the words was almost a relief. At least, she thought, I know exactly where I stand. I am alone in an isolated cottage with a murderer. Aloud, she said, "Will it help to tell me about her?" He clenched his hands, and the sudden crack of a finger joint made them both start nervously. "She was the wickedest woman on earth, dear," he said simply. Cruel and tormenting like a cat. Everything I've ever loved she's taken from me and destroyed it, slowly and horribly, like a cat. That's the truth about Agnes. She's not a woman at all. She's a monstrous cat. And now I've killed her." His voice was quiet and unemotional, and despite her fear, he touched a chord of pity in her. She wished there was something she could do to help. "Would you like a cup of coffee?" she asked, and at once his eyes narrowed. "Why?" he demanded. She shrugged. "No particular reason. I just thought you might, that's all." Abruptly he rose to his feet. "All right," he said, "but I'll come with you." "Do as you please," she replied as unconcernedly as possible, and led the way. With an effort she held her head high. They were crossing the hall to go into the kitchen when the knock came on the front door. Involuntarily she cried out, and a few precious seconds were lost while she stood still, her tired mind unable to take in this new development. "Don't you open it!" he hissed, and his words galvanized her into action. She sprang forward, and as her hand touched the Yale, he gripped her shoulder and tried to drag her away. She bit him. They struggled, then the door swung open, and a woman in jeans and a headscarf stepped into the hall. She had a young, cheerful face. "Oh, gracious," she said. The man's hands fell to his sides. For a moment they all stood staring at one another. "Jimmy," said the strange woman gently. "Jimmy. Oh, I was afraid I might find you here. What have you been doing?" "Nothing," said the man. "I've told you before," went on the woman, "that you mustn't call on strangers like this. You must wait until you've been introduced." She smiled briefly, apologetically, and said, "I'm so sorry about this. My husband is rather, well, unconventional at times." Your husband?" The words seemed to catch in her throat. The woman smiled again, and her warm blue eyes twinkled with sudden friendliness. "Yes," she said, "I'm Agnes." The weight of weariness was so great that it was an effort to think clearly, let alone put thoughts into words. I'm Margaret Hope," she said falteringly, "but I don't understand. Your husband's just been telling me that he's done something terrible to you." "And so he has," replied Agnes, frowning at the man in mock severity. "He's done something very terrible indeed. He's opened the cage doors and let all my chinchillas out. I breed them, you see. I've managed to catch 4 of them, but it's the devil's own job to track them all down in the dark, and by morning they'll be miles away." She sighed. "Sometimes, Jimmy boy," she said, "it's awfully hard to keep patient with you and your pranks." The man stood there, studying the toes of his canvas shoes. He said nothing. "Come along," said Agnes, reaching for his hand. "We've got to go now. We've already taken up a lot of this kind lady's time." Her face mirrored a friendly curiosity. "You're only staying here, aren't you?" "Yes," she replied, "for 2 more weeks." "Oh, well, we live in the farmhouse on the other side of the wood," said Agnes. "Why not stroll over and have a coffee with us one evening?" "Thank you, that would be very nice." Although her lips moved heavily, she was conscious of the unbearable weight of tension lifting. If she hadn't been so tired, she would almost have felt like laughing. The couple moved towards the open front door, Agnes leading the man by the hand. As he passed, he stopped and looked at her with his strange, sad eyes. "I was only pretending this time," he said very quietly. "But I will kill her one day. See if I don't." For a second, he and his wife stood holding hands, their arms outstretched like two people about to take a theatrical bow. Then the door closed behind them, and she collapsed against it, laughing and sobbing with relief. The poor, harmless man was suffering from delusions. How sad! And how adroitly his wife coped with him. It wasn't until she was in bed, almost asleep, that she remembered something. Startling as a flash photograph, she remembered seeing Agnes's hand on his, the fingers rigid, the nails biting into his palm with all the quiet and terrible venom of a cat's claws.